On May 19, 2018, 2 billion people watched what appeared to be a fairy tale. Although Meghan always said beforehand that she didn't even know the royal family before meeting Harry, a lot of people watched their wedding. But today I will reveal the 10 hidden secrets about their royal wedding. Do you really think she wanted to marry quickly because of her biological clock, or just to secure the bag? Harry and Meghan announced their engagement on November 27, 2017. The wedding was set for May 19, 2018. That is less than 6 months. For context, William and Kate announced their engagement in November 2010 and didn't marry until April 2011, a full 5 months of preparation, and even that was considered fast by royal standards. But Harry and Meghan's timeline was different, tighter, more compressed, almost rushed, and insiders close to the palace have suggested that this was not accidental. Sources indicate that Meghan was the driving force behind the accelerated timeline. She had already left her acting career. She had relocated to London. She was living in a kind of institutional limbo, not yet a royal, but no longer a private citizen. The pressure to formalize the relationship was immense. But then there was another factor that rarely gets mentioned. Senior courtiers were privately uneasy about the length of the engagement. Not because they doubted the relationship, but because they felt 6 months was nowhere near enough time to properly prepare Meghan for what royal life would actually demand of her. The protocol training, the institutional briefings, the careful management of press relationships, all of it was compressed into a window that experienced palace aides considered dangerously short. One source close to the household described it as trying to build a plane while already in the air. And what's particularly striking is this: the concerns raised by those courtiers in late 2017 would prove, within 2 years, to be almost prophetic. The cracks that would eventually become public, the tension with staff, the friction with the institution, many of them traced directly back to a preparation period that was simply too short. The rushed timeline wasn't just a scheduling decision. It was the first sign that something was misaligned. But if the rushed timeline was the first warning sign, what happened next was something far more explosive. Weeks before the wedding, Meghan was invited to the royal vault to select her tiara. This is standard procedure for royal brides. But what happened during that process was anything but standard. Meghan had her eye on a particular piece, a diamond bandeau tiara with a detachable brooch at its center, known as the bandeau tiara, which had belonged to Queen Mary. But according to sources with direct knowledge of the situation, Meghan initially requested a different tiara entirely, one that was not available to her. The specific piece she wanted had complicated provenance. Its ownership status within the royal collection was, to put it diplomatically, sensitive. The Queen's dresser, Angela Kelly, was responsible for managing access to the royal jewelry collection, and the relationship between Meghan and Angela Kelly was, from very early on, extremely strained. Kelly reportedly controlled access to the vault with considerable authority, and she and Meghan clashed repeatedly during the wedding preparation period. But then it escalated. Harry, furious at what he perceived as obstruction, reportedly contacted the Queen's office directly, bypassing the normal chain of communication entirely. This was considered a significant breach of protocol. Palace aides were stunned, not because the tiara dispute itself was so dramatic, but because of what it revealed about how Harry and Meghan were already beginning to operate within the institution. They were not working through the system. They were pushing against it. The Queen ultimately intervened personally to resolve the situation. Meghan wore the bandeau tiara on the day, but the damage to her relationship with key household staff had already been done. What looked like a jewelry disagreement was actually something far more significant. It was a power struggle, and it was only just beginning. Now the tiara crisis was contained within palace walls, but the next secret played out in full public view, and the palace's response to it has never been fully explained. In the days before the wedding, photographs emerged of Thomas Markle, Meghan's father, being photographed at an internet cafe, apparently researching the royal family. They looked candid, natural, heartwarming even, but they were staged. Thomas Markle had collaborated with a paparazzi agency to set up the photos, a decision he later admitted to publicly. When the story broke, the damage was immediate and severe. But here is what has never been properly examined. The palace knew, not after the story broke, before. Sources with knowledge of the situation have indicated that senior communications staff at Kensington Palace were aware that Thomas Markle had been in contact with a media agency in the days leading up to the story emerging, and yet nothing was done, no intervention, no warning issued to Thomas Markle through back channels, no contingency plan activated. The question of why has never been satisfactorily answered. One interpretation, charitable to the palace, is that they simply didn't act fast enough, but then there is a less charitable reading. Some insiders have suggested that there were figures within the royal communications structure who were not entirely displeased to see the Markle story create chaos in the days before the wedding. The relationship between the Sussex camp and certain palace communications staff was already fractious, and a destabilized bride, dealing with a family crisis days before her wedding, was a bride with less institutional leverage. What is certain is this: Thomas Markle never made it to Windsor. He pulled out of the wedding entirely, citing heart surgery. Meghan walked the first part of the aisle alone, and the palace's handling of the entire episode remains one of the least examined failures of the pre-wedding period. But while the Markle crisis consumed the press in the days before the wedding, inside the palace, a quieter but equally charged dispute was unfolding over 53 feet of silk. Meghan's wedding veil became one of the most discussed fashion moments of 2018. Designed by Claire Waite Keller for Givenchy, it featured the floral emblems of all 53 Commonwealth nations hand-embroidered along its edge. It was widely praised, called meaningful, called inclusive. But what was never reported at the time was the reaction inside certain royal circles to what that veil actually represented. Because the decision to incorporate all 53 Commonwealth nations was not simply a design choice, it was a statement, and some within the palace interpreted it as an unauthorized one. The Commonwealth is not a decorative concept within the royal family. It is a deeply political institution, one that the Queen considered among the most important elements of her legacy. For Meghan to incorporate it into her wedding aesthetic, without, according to sources, seeking formal approval through the appropriate channels, was considered by some courtiers to be presumptuous at best. At worst, it was seen as Meghan positioning herself as a global figure in her own right, before she had even formally joined the institution. But then there was a second layer to the veil that received almost no coverage at all. Embroidered among the Commonwealth flowers was a small sprig of wintersweet, a flower that grows in the grounds of Kensington Palace. It was a deeply personal touch, but it was also a detail that had not been disclosed to the palace communications team before the wedding. They learned about its significance, along with everyone else, when Kensington Palace released the official description after the ceremony. Small details, but in a world where symbolism is everything, they mattered enormously, and not everyone was charmed. The veil drew quiet fury from certain corners of the palace, but the next secret cut far closer to home, and its consequences would echo for years. In the weeks after the wedding, a story leaked to the British press. It claimed that Meghan had made Kate cry during a bridesmaid dress fitting for Princess Charlotte. The story spread instantly. It became one of the defining narratives of the early Sussex-Cambridge relationship, Meghan as the difficult one, Kate as the wronged party. But then, 3 years later, Meghan told Oprah Winfrey the opposite was true. She said it was Kate who had made her cry, not the other way around. And here is where it gets genuinely complicated, because sources close to both households have since suggested that neither version is entirely complete. What actually happened, according to people with knowledge of the fitting, was a disagreement over the fit of Charlotte's dress. specifically whether it needed to be altered. The exchange became heated. Both women were under enormous stress. But the key detail that has never been properly reported is this: the story that reached the press did not leak accidentally. It was placed. Someone with access to information about what happened in that fitting room made a deliberate decision to share it with a journalist. And that decision, to weaponize a private moment between two women who were both struggling under intense institutional pressure, says more about the environment inside the palace at that time than either Meghan or Kate's behavior does. The dress fitting itself was a minor disagreement between two people navigating an impossibly pressurized situation, but it was transformed into a weapon, and the fact that it was used that way before the wedding had even taken place tells you everything you need to know about the atmosphere that Meghan was walking into. The dress-fitting fallout was ugly, but what happened the night before the wedding itself has never been fully told. The evening of May 18, 2018, Windsor Castle, the wedding rehearsal. By all outward appearances, it was a routine final run-through before one of the most watched events in modern royal history. But behind closed doors, the atmosphere was anything but routine. Sources with knowledge of that evening have indicated that tensions between the Sussex team and palace staff reached a genuine breaking point during the rehearsal itself. The specific flashpoint involved the coordination of the bridal procession inside St. George's Chapel. There were disagreements about positioning, about timing, about who had authority over which decisions, and Meghan, according to people present, was visibly distressed. But then something else happened that has remained almost entirely unreported. Harry reportedly had a significant argument with a senior member of the household staff that evening, an argument serious enough that it required intervention from a more senior courtier to de-escalate. The nature of the dispute related to logistical decisions that Harry felt had been made without consulting him or Meghan, decisions that had been made unilaterally by palace staff who considered the matter settled. Harry did not consider it settled. What is particularly striking about this detail is the pattern it reveals. This was not a one-off clash. It was part of a consistent dynamic that had been building throughout the engagement period, a dynamic in which Harry and Meghan felt consistently sidelined by an institution that considered itself the authority on all decisions, large and small. The rehearsal breakdown was smoothed over by the morning. The ceremony proceeded without visible incident, but the people who were in that room the night before knew something the watching world did not. The fairy tale had fault lines running straight through its foundation. The rehearsal tension was papered over by morning, but what unfolded in the hours before the ceremony revealed a private moment far more complicated than the world realized. When Thomas Markle confirmed he would not be attending the wedding, a decision had to be made quickly. Who would walk Meghan down the aisle? The answer, announced to the public, was Prince Charles. It was presented as a touching gesture, a warm, spontaneous act of paternal kindness from the Prince of Wales toward his future daughter-in-law. But the reality was considerably more layered. Charles did not simply volunteer. According to sources close to the situation, there were internal discussions about several options, including Meghan walking the full length of the aisle alone, which she and Harry had reportedly considered seriously. Charles's involvement was the result of a negotiated decision, not a spontaneous one, and the private conversation between Charles and Meghan before they entered the chapel together has never been reported in full. What is known from sources with indirect knowledge of what was said is that Charles expressed genuine warmth toward Meghan in that moment, but he also, carefully and diplomatically, used the opportunity to communicate something else, a gentle but unmistakable message about the weight of the institution she was joining, about the importance of working within its structures, about patience. Meghan, already emotionally exhausted from weeks of family crisis and institutional friction, received that message in silence. Whether she absorbed it the way Charles intended, that is another question entirely. What the cameras captured was a composed, radiant bride on the arm of her future father-in-law. What they didn't capture was the full complexity of what that moment represented. Two people from entirely different worlds walking into a ceremony that both of them understood in very different ways would change everything. Charles's message to Meghan was delivered with silk-gloved diplomacy, but the next secret involved no diplomacy whatsoever. The guest list for the royal wedding was, on its surface, a carefully curated celebration. 1,200 members of the public selected by ballot. 600 guests inside St. George's Chapel. A smaller, more intimate reception at Frogmore House afterward. But what has never been fully reported is the list of people who were expected to attend and quietly weren't invited. Several of Harry's closest friends from his years in the army were notably absent from the chapel guest list. Men he had served with, men he had described publicly as his brothers. The official explanation, where one was given at all, related to space constraints and the complexity of the guest list. But sources close to Harry have indicated that the reality was more pointed. Certain individuals were flagged by palace staff as potential security or press risks, a designation that some of Harry's circle considered deeply insulting. But then there was a second, less discussed category of uninvited guests. Several of Meghan's former colleagues and friends from her acting career, people she had been close to for years, found themselves quietly removed from early draft guest lists. The reasoning given internally related to the palace's concern about the potential for any guest with significant media connections to generate unwanted press coverage. In practice, it meant that Meghan arrived at her own wedding having been systematically separated from many of the people who knew her best, her support network, the people who could have provided genuine emotional grounding during an extraordinarily pressurized period, had been quietly managed out of the picture. Whether that was a necessary institutional precaution or a deliberate act of isolation is a question that people close to Meghan have never stopped asking. The guest list told one story about who was welcome in Meghan's new world, but what happened inside Frogmore House that evening told quite another. The evening reception at Frogmore House was intimate by royal standards. 200 guests, a live band, a more relaxed atmosphere than the formal luncheon at Windsor Castle earlier in the day, and speeches. What was reported publicly about those speeches was minimal, a few warm quotes, a general sense of celebration, but what was actually said inside that room has been described by people who were present as considerably more revealing. Harry's speech, by multiple accounts, was deeply emotional and at points surprisingly raw. He spoke about feeling for the first time that he had found his person, but then he said something that struck several guests as pointed. He made reference, oblique but unmistakable, to those who knew the context, to the years he had spent feeling unsupported within the institution. He didn't name names, he didn't make accusations, but the implication was clear enough that at least one senior royal figure present in the room visibly stiffened. Charles's speech, by contrast, was warm, controlled, and carefully calibrated. He welcomed Meghan into the family with genuine seeming affection, but sources present have noted that his remarks contained a particular phrase about the importance of duty above personal feeling that landed differently depending on who was listening. To some guests, it sounded like a father's wisdom. To others, it sounded like a warning. What is particularly striking is that within 18 months of those speeches being delivered, the sentiments expressed in that room, the tension between personal happiness and institutional duty, would become the defining public crisis of the modern royal family. The speeches at Frogmore House were not just toasts. They were, in retrospect, a preview of everything that was coming. The speeches at Frogmore House hinted at fault lines already forming. But the final secret concerns what happened immediately after the wedding, and almost no one has reported it accurately. In the days following the wedding, various outlets reported that Harry and Meghan had jetted off on a romantic honeymoon. Locations were speculated. Namibia was mentioned, East Africa, private island retreats. The palace neither confirmed nor denied the specifics, standard practice for royal travel. But here is what was actually happening. Harry and Meghan did not go on their honeymoon immediately after the wedding. They stayed in the United Kingdom for nearly 2 weeks following May 19th. The reason, and this is the detail that has been almost entirely absent from public reporting, was directly related to the institutional fallout from the pre-wedding period. There were meetings that needed to happen, conversations between Harry and senior palace officials that could not be postponed. The Thomas Markle situation had created a communications crisis that required active management. The friction with household staff, some of which had become serious enough to require formal attention, needed to be addressed before it calcified into something permanent. But then there was a second reason that was entirely personal. Meghan, by multiple accounts, was emotionally exhausted in the immediate aftermath of the wedding. The weeks of family crisis, institutional friction, and public scrutiny had taken a significant toll. The decision to remain in the UK in private, away from cameras, was partly logistical and partly about giving Meghan time to simply recover. The honeymoon, when it eventually happened, was real, but the image of two people floating off into a romantic sunset immediately after the ceremony that was carefully constructed, like so much else about that day, the public version and the private reality were two very different things. 10 secrets, one wedding, and a story that was never really about a single day. What these revelations collectively show is something that was invisible to the watching world on May 19th, 2018. The fractures were already there. The rushed timeline left Meghan underprepared for an institution that does not forgive unpreparedness. The tiara crisis revealed a power dynamic between the Sussexes and palace staff that would never truly resolve. The Markle situation exposed a communications infrastructure that failed or chose not to act at a critical moment. The veil, the dress, the rehearsal, the guest list, each one a small fault line, each one dismissed at the time as a minor complication. But fault lines have a way of becoming fractures, and fractures have a way of becoming breaks. By January 2020, less than 2 years after those Windsor bells rang out, Harry and Meghan had announced they were stepping back from royal duties entirely. The world acted shocked, but the people who were inside that institution in the months surrounding the wedding were not shocked at all. They had seen it coming. The question worth asking now is not why it fell apart. The question is, given everything that was already in motion on that spring morning in Windsor, was it ever really going to work? What do you think? Was the institution too rigid to accommodate Meghan, or did Meghan underestimate what joining it would truly demand? Leave your thoughts below, and if you want more deep dives into the stories behind the royal headlines, make sure you subscribe, because there is a great deal more to come.